November 1950. American troops are racing toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. General MacArthur believes the war is almost over. He's promised his soldiers they'll be home by Christmas. Intelligence reports say China won't intervene. The generals in Washington are celebrating. But in Beijing, Mao Zedong is looking at maps and saying something that will change everything. His words weren't a threat. They weren't a warning. They were a promise that would lead to one of the most shocking military reversals in American history. What Mao said in that moment revealed a strategic mind that Washington completely underestimated. And when his promise came true, it would cost tens of thousands of lives and reshape the entire Cold War. This is the story of the words that launched China into a war nobody thought they would dare to fight. MacArthur's forces are pushing north through Korea with almost no resistance. The North Korean army has collapsed. Every military indicator suggests complete victory is days away. American intelligence is reporting that Chinese troops along the border show no signs of preparing for war. MacArthur himself has publicly stated that if China enters the war, they will face total destruction from American air power. The mood in Tokyo headquarters is triumphant, but Mao is watching everything. He's receiving detailed reports about American troop movements, their supply lines, their positions, and he's seeing something that MacArthur's intelligence officers are missing. The Americans are spreading out. They're racing north in separated columns, assuming the war is already won. Their supply lines are stretching thinner every day. The harsh Korean winter is approaching, and MacArthur's confidence is making him careless. In meetings with his top commanders, Mao makes a statement that seems insane to everyone who hears it. He says that MacArthur is walking into the greatest trap in modern military history. He says the Americans don't understand how to fight in Asia. They rely on their technology and their firepower, but they don't understand terrain or weather or the determination of soldiers who have nothing to lose. Mao tells his generals that the American advance is actually a gift, because the further MacArthur pushes north, the more vulnerable his forces become. But here's what makes Mao's statement so significant. He doesn't just predict that China can stop the American advance. He predicts that China will completely reverse it. He says that within weeks, American forces will be in full retreat, abandoning their positions, leaving behind equipment and supplies, running south to avoid being completely surrounded and destroyed. His commanders are skeptical because everyone knows American military power is overwhelming. But Mao understands something they don't. He understands that Americans fight wars expecting quick victories. They're not prepared for the kind of sacrifice and suffering that Chinese soldiers will endure, and he's about to prove it. When Mao receives confirmation that MacArthur's forces have reached the Yalu River, he calls a meeting with his top military and political leadership. The room is tense because everyone knows that what happens next will determine China's future. Some advisors are arguing against intervention. The Soviet Union has promised support, but everyone knows Stalin's promises are unreliable. China's economy is devastated from years of civil war. The military has limited equipment and almost no air force. Going to war with America seems like national suicide. But Mao speaks, and his words are recorded by multiple people in the room. He says that China has no choice but to fight, not because of ideology or because of alliance with North Korea, but because if American forces establish themselves on the Yalu River, China will never have security. He says that Americans will not stop at the border. They will use Korea as a base to threaten China forever. He argues that fighting now, when Americans are overextended and overconfident, is actually China's best opportunity. Then Mao says something that reveals his entire strategy. He states that China doesn't need to win the war. China just needs to prove that America cannot win. He explains that Americans measure victory in terms of territory captured and enemies killed. But China will measure victory differently. If Chinese forces can stop the American advance, if they can prove that American military power has limits, if they can force a stalemate, that itself will be a strategic victory that changes the global balance of power. This is the moment when Mao commits China to war, but he frames it in a way that redefines what winning means. He's not promising to conquer South Korea or destroy American forces. He's promising to create a situation where America's overwhelming military superiority becomes irrelevant. He's betting that Americans don't have the patience or the will to fight a long, grinding war of attrition in the mountains of Korea. And he's about to be proven right in the most dramatic way possible. The genius of Mao's strategy becomes clear in how Chinese forces enter the war. They don't mass at the border where American reconnaissance would spot them. Instead, over several weeks, approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers infiltrate into North Korea using tactics that make them almost invisible to American intelligence. They move only at night. They hide in villages during the day. They dig extensive tunnel and cave systems in the mountains. They bring minimal supplies and plan to live off the land and captured American equipment. American intelligence reports do note some evidence of Chinese troops, but the numbers are estimated at maybe 30 or 40,000. Nobody in MacArthur's command believes China would be foolish enough to send large forces against American military power. Even when frontline units report encountering Chinese soldiers, headquarters dismisses these as small volunteer units, not evidence of major intervention. This is exactly what Mao predicted would happen. He understood that Americans would see what they expected to see, not what was actually there. When Mao gives the order to attack, the result is catastrophic for American forces. On the night of November 25, Chinese forces hit American and South Korean positions all along the front. Units that thought they were facing a defeated enemy suddenly find themselves surrounded by overwhelming numbers of enemy soldiers appearing from seemingly nowhere. The fighting is brutal and close range. Chinese tactics emphasize night attacks, infiltration, and cutting off retreat routes. Within days, the entire American position in North Korea collapses. MacArthur's promised Christmas homecoming turns into what becomes known as the longest retreat in American military history. Units are fighting desperate rearguard actions just to avoid being completely destroyed. The Chosin Reservoir becomes an epic of survival as surrounded American forces fight their way through Chinese positions in sub-zero temperatures. Equipment is abandoned. Positions that took weeks to capture are given up in days. And the trap that Mao described is closing exactly as he said it would. The question is no longer whether Americans can conquer North Korea, but whether they can avoid being pushed completely off the Korean peninsula. The military reversal is stunning, but what Mao understands is that the psychological impact is even more important. For the first time since World War II, American military forces are in full retreat. The myth of American invincibility, which had been built through victory over Japan and Germany, is shattered in the frozen mountains of Korea. Newsreels showing defeated American soldiers struggling south create shockwaves around the world. Countries that were aligning with America start reconsidering. The Soviet Union is emboldened. And most importantly, China establishes itself as a major military power that cannot be ignored. Mao's statement about not needing to win, just needing to prove America cannot win, is being validated every day. The war settles into a grinding stalemate along the 38th parallel. Neither side can achieve decisive victory, but this stalemate is actually a victory for China's strategic position. The most powerful military in the world has been fought to a standstill by a country most Western analysts had dismissed as backward and weak. The implications reshape Cold War dynamics for the next 40 years. Back in Beijing, Mao is explaining to his leadership why this outcome is exactly what China needed. He argues that the war has forced America to recognize China as a major power. It has proven that military technology alone doesn't determine victory. It has shown that determination and willingness to accept casualties can offset material advantages. Most importantly, it has established that China's border is a red line that even American military power will not cross. The cost has been enormous, with hundreds of thousands of Chinese casualties. But in Mao's calculation, this blood price has purchased something invaluable: security and international respect. Western historians would later debate whether Chinese intervention was necessary or whether Mao misread American intentions. But from Mao's perspective, the gamble paid off. China went from being ignored in international affairs to being a power that America had to negotiate with as an equal. The Korean War didn't end in victory for anyone, but it ended with China achieving exactly what Mao said was possible. America learned that there were limits to what military force could accomplish, and the Cold War balance shifted in ways that would echo for decades. The ultimate significance of what Mao said when MacArthur reached the Yalu River is that he backed his words with action and achieved exactly what he promised. He said China would stop the American advance, and they did. He said China would force a stalemate, and they did. He said this would establish China as a power that demanded respect, and it did. The accuracy of his predictions and the willingness to follow through with such a risky strategy established Mao's reputation as a strategic thinker who understood how to fight asymmetric conflicts against superior military forces. For America, the lessons of the Yalu River moment were painful but important. The assumption that technological superiority automatically translates to military victory was proven false. The idea that Asian nations would back down when confronted with American power was shattered. The recognition that local determination and knowledge of terrain could offset massive advantages in firepower and mobility became embedded in American military thinking. Yet somehow, many of these lessons would need to be relearned in Vietnam and later conflicts. For China, the war marked the beginning of their modern emergence as a great power. Mao's words at the Yalu River became part of Chinese national mythology. The story is taught to every Chinese schoolchild as proof that China could stand up to any threat. The volunteer soldiers who fought in Korea are celebrated as heroes who saved the nation. And the strategic principle that Mao articulated, that you don't need to win decisively if you can prevent your enemy from winning, became central to Chinese military doctrine. The irony is that MacArthur, who prided himself on understanding Asia and Asian psychology, completely misread the situation. He believed that China was bluffing and would never dare confront American military power. He interpreted Chinese warnings as weakness rather than genuine intent. His assumption that Western military superiority would automatically prevail blinded him to the reality of what he was walking into. Meanwhile, Mao, leading a country devastated by decades of war, saw the situation clearly and understood exactly how to exploit American overconfidence. Today, the Yalu River moment remains relevant because it illustrates fundamental truths about power, strategy, and the gap between military capability and strategic success. Mao's words weren't just a historical footnote. They were a clear statement of strategic vision that proved accurate in every particular. They remind us that understanding your enemy's psychology, fighting on favorable terms, and redefining what victory means can sometimes matter more than having the biggest military budget or the most advanced technology. And they serve as a warning that confidence without understanding is one of the most dangerous combinations in warfare. What Mao said when MacArthur reached the Yalu River wasn't just memorable words. It was a strategic vision that changed history. His prediction that China could stop and reverse American forces proved accurate. His understanding that creating a stalemate would itself be a strategic victory was validated. And his willingness to back his words with action, despite enormous risks and costs, established China as a major power and changed the trajectory of the Cold War. The lesson resonates across decades. Sometimes the most powerful military in the world can be stopped by an enemy who understands the conflict better, is willing to pay a higher price, and redefines what victory means. MacArthur learned this lesson too late. We should remember it while the learning is still free. If you found this deep dive into history valuable, consider subscribing for more stories about the moments that changed our world.